You're nothing but wolfless trash, and everyone knows it." The words hit like ice water thrown against her face. Kira felt them settle into the familiar hollow space in her chest where other girls her age carried the warmth of their wolves. She kept her head down and continued scrubbing the blood from the ancient arena stones, her knuckles already raw from the harsh bristles and the unforgiving surface that had witnessed 1,000 years of dominance trials. The speaker was Marcus, one of the pack's rising warriors, and his voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Around him, other young wolves laughed, the sound echoing off the towering stone walls that formed the sacred arena. They were here to prepare for tomorrow's trials, to oil their muscles and sharpen their claws, while she was here to clean up the mess from today's preliminary matches. "Look at her," Marcus continued, his boots stopping inches from her scrub brush. 20 years old and still hasn't shifted once. Her wolf probably took one look at her and decided it would rather stay hidden forever. More laughter. Kira's shoulders tensed, but she forced her hands to keep moving in steady circles. The blood was old, dried dark against the pale stone, and it took real effort to scrub it clean. She had learned long ago that stillness invited more attention, while busy hands were often overlooked. The arena stretched around them like an ancient colosseum, its walls carved with symbols that predated written history. The stones beneath her hands were smooth from centuries of use, worn by countless feet and claws, and the occasional splatter of blood from wolves who had pushed too hard in their desire to prove dominance. This was sacred ground, where the pack determined hierarchy through ritual combat, where wolves submitted to those stronger and claimed authority over those weaker. It was also the place where Kira spent most of her waking hours, invisible and essential, cleaning and maintaining the space where others proved their worth. "My little sister shifted when she was 14, Marcus was saying now, his voice growing louder as more pack members gathered to watch the familiar spectacle of her humiliation. "She's got a beautiful silver coat and eyes like amber fire. Even the elders say she'll be a force to reckon with when she comes of age." He crouched down beside Kira, close enough that she could smell the leather polish on his boots and the confidence that radiated from his skin like cologne. "But you're just broken, aren't you? Defective. Your parents must have done something truly terrible to curse their bloodline with a daughter who can't even access her most basic birthright." The scrub brush stilled in Kira's hand for just a moment. Her parents. She had no memory of them, only the vague knowledge that they had died when she was too young to remember, leaving her to be raised by the pack's charity. No one ever spoke of them with anything approaching kindness, and she'd learned not to ask questions that would only bring more ridicule. "Keep working," Marcus commanded, his voice sharp with the authority of someone born to give orders. "The Alpha King arrives tomorrow for the sacred trials, and these stones need to be perfect. Even trash like you should be able to manage that much." The Alpha King. Kira felt a strange flutter in her chest at the words, though she couldn't say why. She had never seen him, of course. Wolves like her were not permitted to witness the great ceremonies where true power was displayed. But she had heard the stories whispered by the servants and the junior warriors, tales of a man so dominant that other alphas submitted to him without question, whose wolf was said to be a creature of legend that could tear through entire armies without breaking stride. He was coming here, to their small border pack, to preside over the most sacred of the trials. The very stones beneath her hands would tomorrow bear witness to displays of power she could barely imagine, and she would be somewhere in the shadows, invisible as always, cleaning up whatever mess was left behind. "The preparations are nearly complete," someone else was saying now, and Kira recognized the voice of Elder Thorn, one of the pack's senior advisors. "The royal procession should arrive by midday tomorrow. Everything must be perfect. The king does not suffer incompetence." "What about her?" Marcus asked, and Kira knew without looking that he was pointing at her. "Should someone like that even be allowed on the grounds when royalty arrives?" There was a pause, and Kira could feel Elder Thorn's eyes on her, weighing and measuring. "She serves her purpose," he said finally. his tone suggesting this was not a kindness but a simple statement of fact. The arena requires maintenance, and she performs that function adequately. As long as she remains invisible and silent, her presence is tolerable. Invisible and silent. Yes, that was what she was good at. That was her entire value to this pack. The ability to clean up their messes without reminding them of her existence. She had perfected the art of moving through the world like a shadow, noticed only when something needed to be scrubbed or hauled or disposed of. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, the warriors moving off to their training and the elders to their planning. Soon she would be alone with the stones and the blood and the weight of tomorrow's impossible expectations. The Alpha King, here in her arena. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange restlessness, as if something deep inside her was stirring for the first time in years. She returned to her scrubbing with renewed focus, working her way across the arena floor as the afternoon light shifted and changed above her. The blood came away slowly, reluctantly, but she was patient. She had learned patience the way other wolves learn to hunt, out of necessity, because the alternative was unbearable. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the arena walls in shades of gold and crimson, Kira allowed herself a moment to sit back on her heels and survey her work. The stones gleamed now, clean and ready for tomorrow's trials, ready for the Alpha King and whatever sacred rituals he would perform on this ancient ground. She gathered her brushes and bucket, preparing to retreat to the small storage room where she kept her supplies, when she heard it. The distant sound of horns echoing across the valley. The royal procession, arriving earlier than expected. Her heart jumped inexplicably, that strange flutter returning stronger than before, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The Alpha King was here. The challenge came from the shadows of the arena walls. "I invoke the ancient right of trial by combat." The voice cut through the supernatural radiance like a blade, cold and sharp with desperate fury. "I challenge the pretender who claims a bloodline that died with her parents." Kira turned from the pillar of silver light that still connected her to the awakened arena stones, her war beast form moving with liquid grace as she sought the source of the interruption. The pack members pressed against the viewing walls murmured uneasily, recognizing the formal challenge even as they struggled to identify who had dared to issue it. Lady Seraphina stepped from the shadows, where she had somehow escaped her guards. But this was not the perfectly composed political bride who had graced court functions with elegant poise. Her golden hair was dishevelled, her silk gown torn and stained, and her blue eyes blazed with the madness of someone who had staked everything on a gamble and watched it crumble to ash. "The bloodline stones lie," she snarled, her voice carrying across the arena with the force of absolute conviction. Ancient magic can be manipulated, illusions crafted, and gullible wolves deceived, but combat reveals truth that cannot be faked. Elder Thorne rose from his position near the ceremonial dais, his aged voice heavy with concern. "Lady Seraphina, you are under arrest for attempted murder. You have no standing to—" "I have the standing of noble blood spilled in service to these territories," she cut him off, her chin lifting with arrogant pride, despite her dishevelled state. "My family has bled and died to protect what we built from the chaos the Silver Moon bloodline brought to these lands. I will not see 20 years of peace destroyed by a servant girl's delusions of grandeur." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Kira felt rage building in her chest, not just her own fury, but the accumulated anger of her bloodline, genetic memory of injustices that had gone unanswered for too long. Through the mate bond, she could feel the Alpha King's matching outrage, his wolf snarling at the casual dismissal of murders that had shaped the political landscape for decades. "You speak of peace," Kira said, her voice carrying the harmonics of wind through silver bells that made the arena stones resonate in response. "Peace built on the corpses of my parents. peace maintained through poison and lies and the systematic erasure of an entire royal bloodline. She began to shift, the transformation flowing around her like liquid starlight as she took human form without dimming the power that radiated from her skin. This was not the broken servant girl who had scrubbed blood from these very stones, but the Silver Moon Queen in all her awakened glory, authority blazing in eyes that held depths like captured starlight. "You want combat," she continued, her words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You want to test the truth of bloodlines through trial by battle? Then let us settle this according to the ancient laws, before witnesses who cannot be deceived." The formal acceptance of the challenge sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd. Trial by combat was an old tradition, rarely invoked in modern times, but still recognised under pack law when questions of bloodline or legitimacy arose. Once issued and accepted, the challenge could only be resolved through battle to the death or complete submission. Lady Seraphina's smile was radiant with triumph and madness in equal measure. Finally, truth without politics, without ancient stones that can be manipulated by clever magic. Just wolf against wolf, power against power, with the moon goddess herself as witness to which bloodline deserves to survive. She began to shift as she spoke, her perfect human form dissolving into something that made the watching pack members gasp with recognition. Her wolf was indeed magnificent, large, powerful, with a silver coat that gleamed almost white in the arena's supernatural light and eyes like chips of frozen sky. This was breeding and training and genetic superiority made manifest, the product of generations of careful bloodline management designed to produce the perfect political weapon. But as she completed her transformation, Kira felt something that sent ice through her veins. This was not just a challenge between rival claimants to power. This was personal, the final act in a vendetta that had begun with her parents' murders and would not end until one of them was dead. The Alpha King stepped forward from the ceremonial dais, his presence commanding immediate attention from every wolf present. "This challenge is witnessed and acknowledged," he said formally, though his voice carried undertones of fury that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. "Let combat commence according to the ancient laws, with the moon goddess as arbiter of truth." The arena fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone, and the soft crackle of silver energy still emanating from the awakened bloodline symbols. Two queens faced each other across ground that had witnessed 1,000 such battles, but never one with stakes that reached so far beyond personal honour. Lady Seraphina moved first, her silver form blurring with supernatural speed as she launched herself across the arena floor. She was fast, faster than Kira had expected, and her attack came with the precision of someone who had been trained for combat from childhood. Claws raked toward Kira's throat with killing intent, seeking to end the battle before her opponent could fully respond. But Kira was no longer the powerless girl who had spent her life accepting whatever cruelty others chose to inflict. The Silver Moon war beast emerged in a burst of radiance that lit up the entire arena, and suddenly she was moving with speed that made Lady Seraphina's attack seem sluggish by comparison. She caught her opponent's claws on her own, the impact sending shockwaves through the stone floor that made the watching pack members scramble for better footing. But where Lady Seraphina's wolf form was the product of careful breeding and political manoeuvring, Kira's carried the genetic memory of creatures that had fought beside gods and shaped the very foundations of their world. The battle that followed was unlike anything the current generation had witnessed. These were not ordinary wolves testing dominance, but forces of nature made flesh, ancient powers settling a debt that had been 20 years in the making. They moved with speed that blurred the eye and struck with force that cracked the arena stones, their supernatural abilities pushing the limits of what mortal flesh could contain. Lady Seraphina fought with the desperate fury of someone who understood that defeat meant not just death, but the complete destruction of everything her family had built through murder and deception. Her attacks came with political precision, seeking weak points and exploiting any opening with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had been raised to view violence as just another tool of statecraft. But Kira fought with something deeper than training or desperation. She fought with the accumulated rage of her bloodline, with genetic memory of powers that predated the current pack structures, with the fury of a daughter who had finally learned the truth about her parents' deaths. Every blow carried 20 years of suppressed strength. Every movement flowed with the grace of creatures that had once ruled territories through right of superior power rather than political manoeuvring. The turning point came when Lady Seraphina, growing desperate as her carefully planned attacks failed to penetrate Kira's defences, overextended herself in a strike aimed at her opponent's heart. It was a killing blow, delivered with all the strength and speed she possessed, but it left her completely vulnerable to counterattack. Kira moved like silver lightning, her claws finding their target with precision that spoke to instincts older than civilization. She could have killed her opponent in that moment, could have ended the battle with a single strike that would have torn out Lady Seraphina's throat and settled all questions of bloodline superiority. Instead, she chose mercy. Her claws stopped just short of delivering a fatal wound, pressing against vulnerable flesh with enough force to draw blood but not enough to kill. The message was clear. She could have taken her opponent's life, but chose not to, demonstrating the kind of restraint that separated true royalty from mere pretenders to power. Lady Seraphina collapsed to the arena floor, her silver wolf form shuddering with exhaustion and the terrible knowledge of complete defeat. She had thrown everything into this final gamble, her family's political standing, her own life, her last desperate chance to preserve the order that had elevated her above her station, and lost it all to power that transcended anything she had been trained to fight. The arena fell silent as the implications of what they had witnessed settled over the assembled crowd. This had not been just a battle between rival wolves, but a trial by combat that had definitively settled questions of bloodline, legitimacy, and the right to rule. The Silver Moon Queen had faced her greatest enemy and emerged victorious through superior power and the kind of mercy that only true nobility could afford to show. The Alpha King stepped into the arena circle, his presence adding weight to what everyone had already recognized. "The challenge is concluded," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the sacred space. "The Silver Moon bloodline is proven legitimate, its queen acknowledged by right of combat and divine witness." He moved to stand beside Kira's transformed form, and the symbolism was lost on no one present. This was not just the acknowledgement of her bloodline, but the public claiming of his mate, the declaration that their bond transcended any political arrangement that had come before. "Let all present bear witness," he continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I, Alpha King of all territories, take Kira of the Silver Moon bloodline as my true and only mate. Let the bonds be complete, let the alliance be sealed, and let any who would challenge this union step forward now or hold their peace forever." The silence that greeted his declaration was complete and telling. No voice was raised in protest. No challenge issued against the union of two bloodlines that together commanded power beyond anything the current generation had seen. Even Lady Seraphina, defeated and bleeding on the arena floor, could offer no further resistance to the inevitable. Ancient magic stirred in response to the formal claiming, silver and gold light intertwining in patterns that spoke to forces older than pack law or political convenience. The mate bond that had connected them since their first meeting blazed to full strength, no longer constrained by duty or circumstance, finally free to bind them together as they were always meant to be. Around the arena's perimeter, pack members began to kneel in recognition of what they had witnessed, not just the victory of one bloodline over another, but the emergence of a new order that would reshape their world according to principles of justice rather than political expedience. The Silver Moon Queen had returned, the Alpha King had chosen truth over convenience, and together they would forge a future built on foundations stronger than murder and deception. As the morning sun reached its zenith above the sacred arena, Kira felt the last of her transformation complete itself. She was no longer the hidden daughter, the suppressed bloodline, the servant girl who cleaned up other people's messes while remaining invisible herself. She was the Silver Moon Queen, acknowledged and claimed, ready to take her place beside the Alpha King and help him build a kingdom worthy of the power they commanded together. 3 months had changed everything. Kira stood on the royal balcony that overlooked the Eastern Territories, her hands resting on the carved stone railing as she watched the sun paint the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. The view stretched for miles in every direction. Forests that had once been battlefields, villages that had known only the peace that came from unified rule, and roads that now carried trade instead of armies. This was her kingdom now, hers and his, built on foundations of truth rather than the lies that had shaped the previous generation. The transformation had not been easy. Rooting out the conspirators who had participated in her parents' murders had taken weeks of careful investigation, and not all of them had gone quietly. But justice, delayed for 20 years, had finally been served. The Silver Moon Territories had been restored to their rightful place in the kingdom's hierarchy, their ancient bloodline acknowledged, and their stolen lands returned. The pack members who had served her family before the murders had emerged from exile, bringing with them knowledge and traditions that had been suppressed for far too long. The compound that had once felt like a prison had been transformed into a true royal seat, worthy of the power it now housed. Behind her she heard the soft sound of footsteps on marble, and she did not need to turn to know who approached. The mate bond had grown stronger with each passing day, settling into something deeper than mere recognition or political alliance. This was partnership in the truest sense, 2 equal powers working together to reshape their world according to principles of justice and compassion. "The Eastern Lords have agreed to the new trade agreements," the Alpha King said as he joined her at the balcony's edge, his presence warm and solid against her back. "The transition is nearly complete." She leaned into him, savouring the simple pleasure of contact without political complications or external threats forcing them apart. "And the Northern Territories?" "Sending delegations to negotiate formal alliances. It seems word has spread about what happened in the arena, and suddenly everyone wants to be on the right side of history." His voice carried amusement mixed with satisfaction. Amazing how quickly political calculations change when people realise the Silver Moon bloodline has returned to claim what was stolen. The irony was not lost on either of them. The same families who had dismissed her as worthless trash were now sending gifts and formal requests for audiences, desperate to secure favourable relationships with the Queen they had spent 20 years believing was safely dead. Fear, it seemed, was a remarkably effective motivator for political cooperation. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where her parents had once ruled, with the same view spread before them. "Choosing me over the Eastern Alliance? The marriage to Lady Seraphina would have secured territories without the upheaval we've had to manage." His arms came around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest with a possessiveness that still made her pulse quicken. "Never," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. That alliance was built on lies and murder. Whatever temporary stability it might have provided would have crumbled eventually, and the cost would have been far higher than anything we've faced. She turned in his arms, looking up into eyes that no longer held the conflict between duty and desire that had once torn them both apart. "Even when the northern clans tested our borders last month, even when we had to prove our strength through combat instead of diplomacy." "Especially then," he replied, his hands coming up to frame her face with the reverence of someone who still marvelled at being allowed to touch something so precious. "You fought beside me, matched my power with your own, showed them that this kingdom is ruled by equals rather than a king and his political accessory. They didn't just submit to superior force, they recognized superior right. The memory of that battle still sent heat through her veins. After 20 years of hiding her true nature, the freedom to fight at full strength, to stand as an equal partner in defending what they had built together, had been intoxicating. The northern clans had come expecting to test a newly unstable kingdom, only to face the combined might of two ancient bloodlines working in perfect harmony. They had not made the mistake of challenging the new order again. "The pack seems to have adjusted well," she observed, thinking of the changes she had witnessed over the past months. "I was worried there would be more resistance to the upheaval." "They've seen what we can accomplish together," he said simply. "Prosperity, justice, protection from external threats, results speak louder than political theory, and they remember what things were like under the old system, when fear and favour determined more than merit or need." It was true. The territories were thriving in ways they had not experienced in decades. Trade flowed freely along roads that were safe from bandits, crops grew in fields that were no longer battlegrounds, and pack members went about their daily lives without the constant underlying tension that had characterized the previous regime. Peace, it turned out, was far more productive than the careful balance of terror that had maintained stability through strength alone. "There is something I need to tell you," she said, her hand moving unconsciously to rest against her still flat stomach. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but she felt his entire body go still behind her as the implications registered through their bond. Kira. Her name on his lips was barely a whisper, heavy with wonder, and something that might have been awe. "Are you—" "3 weeks now," she confirmed, turning to see the expression that was spreading across his face like sunrise. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything, but the royal physician confirmed it this morning." The silence that followed was profound, charged with emotions too complex for words. This was not just personal joy, but the promise of continuity, the assurance that the bloodlines they had fought to restore would continue into the next generation. Their child would be born into a world shaped by justice rather than political expedience, raised in the light rather than hidden in shadows. "Our heir," he breathed, his hands moving to cover hers where it rested against her stomach. "Our child will know what it means to be loved, to be wanted, to have parents who chose each other rather than accepting a political arrangement." The contrast with their own experiences was stark and deliberate. She had been hidden, suppressed, raised to believe herself worthless. He had been groomed for leadership, but taught that personal happiness was secondary to political necessity. Their child would know better, would grow up understanding that power came with the responsibility to use it wisely, but also with the right to choose love over convenience. "He or she will be strong," she said with quiet confidence, feeling the truth of it through bloodlines that had shaped the supernatural world for centuries. "The combination of our genetics, the palace mages predict abilities that will surpass even what we possess individually." "Dangerous knowledge," he murmured, but his tone carried excitement rather than concern. "There will be those who see a child that powerful as either a weapon to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated." "Let them try," she replied, silver light flickering in her eyes as protective instincts that were older than civilization stirred to life. "They will learn what it means to threaten the offspring of the Silver Moon bloodline, what it costs to attack something the Alpha King has claimed as his own." The promise hung between them, fierce and absolute. They had proven their strength against political enemies and foreign threats, had demonstrated that their combined power could reshape kingdoms and restore justice to territories that had known only corruption for decades. Anyone foolish enough to threaten their child would discover that there were fates worse than death for those who crossed certain lines. But tonight, standing together on the balcony that overlooked their restored kingdom, such threats seemed distant and manageable. They had transformed themselves from impossible mates into true partners, had built something real and lasting from the ashes of lies and murder. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with strength that was greater than the sum of its parts. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying weight that political marriage vows could never match. I loved you when I thought you were a powerless servant, and I love you now that I know you're a queen who could rule territories in her own right. But mostly, I love you for choosing me when you could have claimed power that would have made you independent of any alliance. I love you too, she replied, rising on her toes to meet his kiss with the passion of someone who no longer had to hide what she felt. For seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself, for choosing justice over convenience, for being the mate my bloodline recognized before my mind understood what it meant. The kiss deepened, carrying promises of the future they would build together and the legacy they would leave for the child growing beneath her heart. They had come so far from that first impossible moment in the arena when his war beast had bowed to a servant girl everyone believed was worthless. Now they stood as equals, as partners, as the founders of a dynasty that would reshape the supernatural world for generations to come. The Silver Moon Queen and her Alpha King, ruling together under stars that had witnessed their transformation from nothing to everything, forever had a different meaning now. Kira lay in the royal chambers beside the Alpha King, her head resting on his chest as moonlight streamed through windows that looked out over territories that had known only peace for the better part of a year. His hand moved in gentle circles over the curve of her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy, a living promise of the future they had built from the ashes of lies and murder. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of their breathing and the distant calls of night birds that had returned to forests no longer scarred by warfare. This was contentment in its purest form, not the desperate passion of those early days when they had fought against political necessity and their own understanding of what was possible, but the deep, abiding peace of two souls who had found their perfect match. "Do you remember?" she said softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin that glowed faintly with the residual magic that always surrounded them now. "When you told me the mate bond would fade if we didn't act on it?" His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "I remember a lot of foolish things I said when I was trying to convince myself that duty mattered more than destiny." His hand stilled on her belly, and she felt the flutter of movement beneath his palm, their child responding to the sound of his voice even from within the womb. "I was wrong about so many things." "You were trying to do what you thought was right," she said, lifting her head to look at him in the silvered darkness. "You couldn't have known what I truly was when even I didn't understand it." "I should have trusted my wolf," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with the kind of intimacy that still made her pulse quicken even after months of marriage. He knew from that first moment in the arena. All my political calculations, all my careful reasoning about kingdoms and alliances, none of it mattered to the part of me that recognized you as mine. The memory of that day felt like something from another lifetime now. The girl who had scrubbed blood from arena stones while accepting whatever cruelty others chose to inflict seemed like a stranger, someone she had known but never truly been. That version of herself had been necessary, a disguise that kept her alive long enough to discover her true nature. But she belonged to the past now. "I spent 20 years believing I was broken," she mused, her free hand moving to rest over his heart, where she could feel the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her happiness. 20 years accepting that I would never have the things other wolves took for granted, pack status, respect, love. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. And now? Now I understand that I was never broken. I was hidden. There's a difference." She smiled at the profound truth of it, at how completely her understanding of herself had transformed. "My parents bound my power to keep me safe, but they couldn't bind my worth. That was always there, waiting for someone to see it." "I saw it," he said simply, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. "From the moment my war beast bowed to you, I knew you were extraordinary. I just didn't understand the scope of what that meant until the bloodline stones blazed to life and announced to the world who you truly were." The bloodline stones still responded to her presence, though more gently now that her power had settled into its natural patterns. The arena had become a place of pilgrimage, wolves travelling from distant territories to witness the restored silver moon symbols and pay respects to the queen who had returned from the dead to reclaim her birthright. She found a certain poetic justice in the fact that the space where she had once been invisible now served as testimony to her legitimacy. "Our child will never know what that feels like," she said, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness of a mother who would reshape the world before allowing her offspring to suffer the way she had. "We'll never doubt their worth or accept less than they deserve." "No," he agreed, his hand resuming its gentle movement over her belly. "They'll be born into a world where truth matters more than political convenience, where bloodlines are acknowledged rather than hidden, where strength is used to protect rather than exploit." The child moved again, stronger this time, as if responding to the conversation about their future. The palace healers predicted extraordinary abilities, not just the combined strength of both bloodlines, but something entirely new, power that would define the next generation of supernatural leadership. Other kingdoms were already sending representatives to discuss potential alliances, hoping to secure favourable relationships with what promised to be the most powerful bloodline in recorded history. "They'll have choices we never did," Kira continued, the words carrying the weight of promises she intended to keep. "The freedom to follow their heart without worrying about kingdoms hanging in the balance, the right to choose love over duty, passion over politics." "Speaking from experience?" he asked, though his tone carried amusement rather than concern. "Speaking from the knowledge that we were lucky," she replied seriously. "The mate bond could have connected us to people we couldn't stand, could have forced us to choose between personal happiness and the greater good. Instead, we found each other, equals in power, compatible in values, genuinely in love rather than just politically suitable." "More than luck," he said, rolling onto his side so he could look at her properly, his hand moving to cup her face with the reverence he had shown from the beginning. "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes when she crafts these bonds. She knew what our kingdoms needed, knew what we needed, and she gave us exactly what would serve both purposes." The theology might be debatable, but the results were undeniable. Their union had brought stability to territories that had known only careful balances of power maintained through fear. Trade flourished, agriculture thrived, and pack members went about their daily lives without the underlying tension that had characterized the previous generation. Peace, it turned out, was remarkably conducive to prosperity. "I love you," she said, the words carrying deeper meaning now than they had in those early desperate days when love had seemed like an impossible luxury. "Not because the mate bond tells me to, not because you're the Alpha King and I'm supposed to submit to your authority, but because of who you choose to be when no one is watching." "Who am I when no one is watching?" "Someone who would rather be right than comfortable. Someone who chose justice over political expedience even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. Someone who sees worth in people others dismiss as worthless." She leaned forward to kiss him, tasting the future on his lips. "Someone who loves me, not for what I can give you, but for who I am when I stop trying to be invisible." "And who are you when you stop trying to be invisible?" "Someone who was always meant to stand beside you rather than behind you. Someone strong enough to be your equal rather than your subject. Someone who understands that real love isn't about completing each other, it's about being whole individually and choosing to share that wholeness with the person who sees all of it and loves what they find." The kiss deepened, carrying echoes of their mating ceremony in the arena where ancient stones had blazed with recognition and pack members had knelt before power that transcended political arrangements. But it also carried promises of quiet moments like this one, intimate conversations in moonlit chambers, the simple pleasure of being completely known and completely loved by the one person in the world who truly understood what they had built together. When they finally broke apart, she settled back against his chest with the contentment of someone who had found their place in the world. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to love someone everyone else dismissed as nothing." She smiled in the darkness, thinking of the girl who had believed herself worthless and the woman who now understood her true value. For proving that sometimes the most important transformations happen not when we become someone different, but when we finally remember who we were always meant to be. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her as if he could hold this moment forever. "My queen, my mate, my equal, the mother of our future, and the architect of everything we'll build together." Outside their window, the territories they ruled together stretched toward horizons that held only promise now. The Silver Moon Queen and her Alpha King had found each other against impossible odds, had built a love story from the wreckage of political necessity, had chosen truth over lies and justice over convenience, and in choosing each other, they had chosen a future where their children would never have to hide what they were or accept less than they deserved. The mate bond had brought them together, but love, real, chosen, deliberate love, would carry them forward into whatever came next. Forever, after all, was just getting started. The ground trembled beneath Kira's feet before she saw him. It started as a vibration in the ancient arena stones, a rhythm that seemed to match her suddenly racing heartbeat. Then came the sound, not just the thunder of hooves, but something deeper, more primal. The very air seemed to thicken with an energy that made her wolf stir restlessly for the first time in months, a sensation so foreign she nearly dropped her cleaning bucket in shock. She pressed herself against the arena wall, trying to become even more invisible than usual as the royal procession swept through the main gates. The lesser wolves of her pack had already arranged themselves in careful formation, heads bowed in submission, but she remained in the shadows where Trash belonged. And then she saw him. The Alpha King rode at the centre of the procession on a destrier as black as midnight, but it was not the horse that stole her breath. It was the man himself, radiating power like heat from a forge. Even at a distance, she could feel the weight of his presence pressing against her consciousness, demanding acknowledgement from every wolf within miles. Her pack members were practically prostrate now, their wolves cowering before a dominance so absolute it seemed to rewrite the very laws of nature. He was larger than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and commanding, with dark hair that caught the late afternoon light and eyes that seemed to survey his new domain with the casual confidence of a conqueror. This was not just an alpha. This was the alpha, the wolf all others measured themselves against and found wanting. Behind him rode his personal guard, 12 of the most dangerous-looking warriors she had ever seen, and beside the procession loped something that made her blood freeze in her veins, his war beast. She had heard the stories, whispered in terrified reverence around cooking fires and during late-night watches. The king's companion was not a wolf, but something older, something that predated the neat categories her people used to organize the world. It was massive, easily twice the size of the largest pack wolf, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb light and eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. The creature moved with fluid grace beside the king's horse, and every wolf in the vicinity gave it a wide berth. This was a being that had torn through battlefields, that had stood beside the Alpha King as he united the warring territories under his rule. It was death given form and loyalty, and it served only one master. Kira tried to make herself smaller against the wall, but movement caught her attention from the opposite side of the arena. A vision in white silk and golden hair was gliding forward to meet the procession, flanked by her own retinue of perfectly groomed attendants, Lady Seraphina. Even from a distance, the woman was breathtaking in the way of creatures born to be admired. Her hair cascaded down her back like spun sunlight, and her dress seemed to float around her as if she were walking on air instead of common earth. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she deserved the luxury and power that surrounded her like armour. This was the king's intended bride, the political alliance that would unite two of the most powerful territories under a single crown. She was everything Kira was not: beautiful, refined, confident, and possessed of a wolf so magnificent that bards composed songs about its silver coat and piercing blue eyes. The king dismounted with fluid ease, his boots hitting the ground with a sound that seemed to echo through Kira's bones. Even standing still, he commanded the space around him, drawing every eye and bending every will toward acknowledgement of his supremacy. She watched as Lady Seraphina approached him with a smile that could have launched wars, her hands extended in graceful welcome. "Your Majesty," Seraphina's voice carried across the arena, melodic and perfectly modulated. "Welcome to our humble territory. We are honoured beyond measure by your presence." The king inclined his head politely, but Kira noticed something that made her frown. His attention was not entirely focused on the woman before him. Instead, his gaze kept drifting, scanning the arena grounds as if he were looking for something specific, something he had not yet found. "The preparations appear extensive," he replied, his voice carrying a depth that seemed to resonate in her chest. "I trust the sacred trials will proceed without complication." "Of course, Your Majesty. Every detail has been attended to with the utmost care." But even as they spoke, Kira could see the king's war beast behaving strangely. The massive creature was no longer at his master's side, but had begun to pace the perimeter of the arena, its great head swinging back and forth as if tracking a scent. Its glowing eyes swept across the assembled crowd, dismissing the pack members one by one, searching for something that continued to elude it. The wrongness of it made Kira's wolf pace restlessly in the cage of her ribs. She had grown so accustomed to the silence where her wolf should be that this sudden stirring felt like a violation, as if some sleeping part of her had been rudely awakened by forces beyond her understanding. Elder Thorn was approaching now, flanked by the other senior members of the Pack Council, their expressions carefully composed in masks of respectful welcome. "Your Majesty, if you would permit us to escort you to your quarters. We have prepared our finest accommodations, and the evening feast has been arranged according to your specifications." The king nodded absently, but his attention was still divided, still searching. Lady Seraphina moved closer to him, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm, in a gesture that spoke of intimacy and possession. She was everything a queen should be, poised, beautiful, politically astute, the perfect complement to his power. So why did Kira feel as though something fundamental was wrong with the picture they presented? "The trials begin at dawn?" the king asked, his voice cutting through her confused thoughts. "Yes, Your Majesty. The sacred circle has been prepared according to the ancient traditions, and the stones have been blessed by our eldest shamans." Kira's cheeks burned at the mention of the stones. She had spent the entire day on her hands and knees, scrubbing away blood and grime so that the sacred space would be worthy of royal attention. Her contribution was invisible, unacknowledged, but essential, the foundation that allowed others to shine. The war beast had stopped pacing now, its massive form gone perfectly still at the far edge of the arena. Kira followed its gaze and realized with a jolt of terror that it was looking directly at her hiding place against the wall. Those ancient intelligent eyes had found her in the shadows where she had spent her entire life being overlooked. Her wolf went completely quiet, as if sensing a predator so far beyond her capabilities that stillness was the only chance of survival. But the war beast did not move to attack. Instead, it tilted its great head slightly to one side, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across the arena. Kira could not breathe, could not move, could not think beyond the terrible certainty that she had been seen, truly seen for the first time in her life. And then, the king's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "We will rest now," he announced, his attention returning to his hosts. "Tomorrow's trials require preparation." The spell broke. The war beast looked away, the procession began to move toward the guest quarters, and Kira sagged against the wall as relief flooded through her trembling limbs. But even as the royal party disappeared from view, she could not shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in that moment of recognition. The Alpha King was here, in her territory, and tomorrow the sacred trials would begin. But tonight, as she retreated to her small corner of the servants' quarters, Kira could not escape the memory of ancient eyes that had looked at her and seen something worth noticing. Dawn came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Kira had spent the night tossing restlessly on her narrow cot, haunted by the memory of ancient eyes that had seen her when she was meant to be invisible. Her wolf had remained unusually active, pacing and prowling in the space behind her ribs where it usually lay dormant, as if something in the Alpha King's presence had awakened parts of her she had thought were broken beyond repair. She was back in the arena before first light, making final preparations for the sacred trials that would begin within the hour. The stones gleamed in the pre-dawn darkness, every surface polished to perfection, every ancient symbol traced clean of debris. This was her contribution to the sacred ritual, invisible, essential labour that allowed others to claim glory. The arena was beginning to fill now as pack members took their assigned positions in the viewing stands carved into the surrounding walls. She kept to the shadows at ground level, checking and rechecking that every detail met the impossible standards required when royalty was watching. Her cleaning supplies were tucked discreetly behind one of the massive pillars that supported the arena's upper levels, ready to address any mess that might mar the sacred space. She could feel the energy building as more wolves arrived, their excitement and nervous energy creating a buzz that seemed to vibrate through the ancient stones. The sacred trials were held only once every few years, and never before had they been overseen by the Alpha King himself. This was history in the making, and she was privileged to witness it from the shadows. A commotion near the main entrance drew her attention. The royal party was arriving, resplendent in ceremonial dress that caught the first rays of sunrise and threw them back in brilliant displays of gold and silver. Lady Seraphina glided beside the Alpha King, her white gown trailing behind her like sea foam, her golden hair crowned with a circlet of precious stones that marked her as his intended bride. They made a magnificent pair, power and beauty united in a spectacle that took her breath away. This was what royalty looked like, what dominance and grace combined could accomplish. She felt a stab of something that might have been longing or might have been loss, quickly suppressed before it could grow into something dangerous. The king took his place on the ceremonial dais that had been erected at the arena's north end, Lady Seraphina settling gracefully at his side. The pack elders arranged themselves in order of precedence, while the royal guard took strategic positions around the perimeter. Everything was perfect, choreographed to display the proper hierarchy and respect for tradition. Everything except his war beast. The massive creature was pacing again, just as it had yesterday, its glowing eyes scanning the crowd with restless intensity. Kira pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind her pillar, but she could not shake the feeling that those ancient eyes were searching specifically for her hiding place. Elderthorn stepped forward to begin the opening ceremonies, his voice carrying clearly across the sacred space as he invoked the blessings of the moon goddess and the ancient spirits that governed pack law. The words were old, older than memory, passed down through generations of shamans and spiritual leaders who had overseen these rituals since time immemorial. But Kira was not listening to the ceremonial invocations. Her attention was fixed on the war beast, which had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at her hiding spot with an intensity that made her wolf cower in terror. She could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stare back at the creature that held her pinned with its gaze. And then the impossible happened. The war beast moved. Not toward the dais where its master sat in regal splendour, not toward the ceremonial circle where the trials would soon begin, but directly toward her pillar at the arena's edge. Its massive paws made no sound on the ancient stones, but she could feel each step like a hammer blow against her ribs. Pack members began to notice the creature's movement, whispers rippling through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat. The royal guard tensed, hands moving to weapons, unsure whether their intervention would be welcome or catastrophic. Even Elder Thorne faltered in his invocation, his aged voice trailing off as all eyes turned to watch the war beast's purposeful approach. Kira wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to disappear into whatever hole she could find and wait for this nightmare to pass. But her feet remained rooted to the stone floor, her body frozen in place by terror and something else she could not name. The war beast rounded the pillar and stopped directly in front of her. So close she could feel the heat radiating from its massive frame and smell the wild, dangerous scent of a creature that belonged to no civilization. This close, she could see that its fur was not simply black, but contained depths like midnight water, and its eyes held an intelligence that was both animal and something far more complex. The arena had gone completely silent now. Not a whisper, not a breath, not even the rustle of fabric as hundreds of wolves held themselves perfectly still to witness whatever was about to unfold. The war beast lowered its great head and bowed. The sound that escaped Kira's throat was barely human. Shock, terror, and something like recognition tore through her as the legendary creature, the beast that bowed to no one, that had stood beside the Alpha King as he conquered territories and united warring packs, pressed its massive skull to the arena floor in a gesture of perfect submission. To her, to worthless, wolfless, broken Kira, who cleaned blood from stones and tried to be invisible. Impossible! The word came from the dais, spoken in the Alpha King's deep voice, with a mixture of awe and confusion that echoed through the suddenly electric air. She looked up to find him on his feet, his ceremonial composure shattered as he stared at the tableau before him with an expression she could not read, and then she felt it. The snap was audible, like lightning striking stone, like a chain breaking under impossible tension. Something golden and bright and utterly foreign blazed to life in her chest, a connection so powerful it drove her to her knees beside the still bowing war beast. The bond stretched across the arena like a living thing, linking her to the Alpha King with threads of light that only she could see. Mate. The word echoed in her head, and she did not know if it came from her wolf or from the ancient presence still examining her, or from him. But she knew with a certainty that transcended logic or social hierarchy or every cruel word she had ever been told about her worthlessness, that it was true. The Alpha King was moving now, descending from the dais with fluid grace, while Lady Seraphina remained frozen in shock. His eyes never left Kira's face as he approached, and she could see her own stunned recognition reflected in their depths. This was not supposed to happen. This violated every law of politics and propriety and common sense. But the mate bond cared nothing for such human concerns. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could feel the power radiating from his skin like fever heat. The war beast had not moved from its submissive position, creating a strange tableau of dominance and deference that defied everything she thought she knew about the world. "Stand," he said softly, and though his voice was quiet, it carried clearly through the arena's supernatural silence. She tried. Her legs shook with the effort, but she managed to rise to her feet, acutely aware of her simple servant's dress and the contrast it made with his ceremonial regalia. She was nothing beside him, a shadow given form, but the golden threads binding them together cared nothing for such disparities. He extended his hand to her, palm up, an invitation and a choice. Behind him she could see Lady Seraphina's face twisted with rage and disbelief, could see the pack elders exchanging horrified glances as the careful choreography of their political alliance crumbled in real time. The royal guard looked uncertain, unsure whether to protect their king from this unprecedented disruption, or simply bear witness to whatever forces had been unleashed. The extended hand waited. The mate bond pulled at her like a tide, demanding acknowledgement of the truth that had been written in her bones since birth. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The king's private chambers felt like stepping into another world. Kira had never seen luxury like this. Silk tapestries depicting ancient battles, furniture carved from wood so dark they seemed to absorb light, and windows that looked out over territory that stretched to the horizon. But none of it registered properly because her entire being was focused on the man who had brought her here, whose presence filled the space like barely contained lightning. The mate bond hummed between them, a golden thread that had not dimmed since the moment it snapped into place in the arena. She could feel his emotions bleeding through the connection, confusion, desire, and something that felt dangerously close to despair. The intensity of it was overwhelming, like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. He had not spoken during the walk from the arena to his quarters, his royal guard clearing a path through stunned pack members who pressed themselves against walls to avoid his gaze. Lady Seraphina had been left behind on the ceremonial dais, her perfect composure finally cracking as she realised the political implications of what had just occurred. Now they were alone, and the silence felt charged with possibilities that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "This is impossible," he said finally, his back to her as he stared out the window at the territory spread below. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, but she could feel the turmoil beneath his controlled exterior through the bond that connected them soul to soul. "I know," she whispered, because what else could she say? She was nobody, nothing. A servant girl who cleaned blood from stones while others claimed glory. That the alpha king of all wolves could be bound to someone like her was beyond comprehension. He turned then, and she saw the war being fought behind his eyes, duty against desire, politics against the primal recognition that had claimed them both. "Do you understand what this means? What it will cost?" She shook her head mutely. How could she understand politics and alliances and the great game of power that shaped kingdoms? All she knew was that something fundamental had changed in the arena, that the golden thread connecting them was real and undeniable and stronger than anything she had ever experienced. "My marriage to Lady Seraphina is not a matter of personal preference," he continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence of a man accustomed to explaining policy. "It is a political necessity. Her father controls the Eastern Territories, and without that alliance, my kingdom remains vulnerable to invasion from the northern clans." Each word felt like a physical blow. She had known, of course, that the intended marriage served purposes far beyond romance. She was not naive enough to believe that creatures of such power made choices based purely on emotion. But hearing it stated so clearly, with such clinical precision, made her chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with the mate bond. "I understand," she managed, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You have duties, responsibilities that someone like me could never—" "No." The word cut through her self-deprecation like a blade. "Do not diminish what you are." He crossed the room in 3 strides, his movements predatory and graceful, and suddenly he was standing close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell the wild scent that marked him as something far more dangerous than merely human. The mate bond flared between them, singing with recognition and need. "I can feel you," he said softly, his hand rising to hover just inches from her face without quite making contact. your emotions, your thoughts. They bleed through this connection we share. I know you think yourself worthless, broken, but that is not what I feel when I touch this bond." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to step back, to retreat to the safe distance where she could pretend to be invisible, but his presence held her frozen in place, like a rabbit caught in a predator's gaze. "What do you feel?" she asked, barely daring to voice the question. His eyes searched her face for a long moment before he answered. "Power," he said simply. "Not the kind that comes from political manoeuvring or military conquest, but something older, something that recognizes me as surely as I recognize it." The words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. Her wolf, which had been unusually quiet since the arena incident, stirred restlessly behind her ribs, as if responding to some call she could not consciously hear. "That is why this is impossible," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because I want you. Because every instinct I possess is screaming at me to claim you, to mark you, to make the bond complete regardless of the consequences, and because doing so would destroy everything I have built." The honesty in his admission stole her breath. She could feel the truth of it through the mate bond, could sense the war between desire and duty that was tearing him apart from the inside. He was the Alpha King, accustomed to taking what he wanted, but the weight of his crown made even his most basic instincts a luxury he could not afford. "So what happens now?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. He stepped back then, putting physical distance between them, even as the golden thread of their connection stretched taut with the separation. "Now I marry Lady Seraphina as planned. The alliance is too important to sacrifice, even for this." Even for this. The words echoed in the space between them, carrying implications that made her chest tighten with grief for something that could never be. She had spent her whole life accepting that she would never have the things other wolves took for granted: pack status, respect, love. She should be accustomed to disappointment by now. But this felt different. This felt like losing a part of herself she had not known existed until the moment it was ripped away. "And me?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Something flickered across his expression. Pain, regret, something that might have been longing. "You will remain here with your pack, as you always have. The bond will fade in time if we do not act upon it." She nodded, accepting the dismissal with the same grace she had learned to accept all the other cruelties life had offered her. She turned toward the door, ready to retreat to her small corner of existence and pretend this impossible moment had never occurred. "Kira." Her name spoken in his voice stopped her cold. She had not told him her name, she realized. In all the chaos and confusion of the arena, introductions had seemed irrelevant, but somehow he knew it, and hearing it from his lips made the mate bond pulse with renewed intensity. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "I need you to know," he said, and when she turned back to face him, she saw vulnerability in his expression that no king should ever reveal. "If circumstances were different, if I were not bound by duties that affect thousands of lives, there is nothing in this world I would want more than to make you mine." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them could cross, beautiful and tragic and absolutely sincere. She could feel the truth of it through their connection, could sense the depth of his regret and the strength of his resolve. "I know," she said softly, because she did know, could feel it in every fibre of the bond that connected them. "Thank you for telling me." She left then, walking through corridors that felt somehow dimmer than they had before, carrying the weight of an impossible love and the knowledge that some gifts were too dangerous to claim. Behind her she could feel him through the mate bond, standing alone in his luxurious chamber, as trapped by his power as she had ever been by her lack of it. The sacred trials would continue tomorrow, and he would wed Lady Seraphina as planned, and she would return to cleaning blood from stones and being invisible. But something had changed between them in that room, something that no amount of political necessity could completely erase. and as she made her way back to the servants' quarters, Kira wondered if the mate bond truly would fade as he had promised, or if they would both spend the rest of their lives carrying this golden thread of connection like a beautiful scar across their souls. The Oracle's cave existed in a place where time moved differently. Kira felt it the moment she stepped across the threshold, a strange displacement, as if the world outside had become a distant memory, and this ancient hollow carved into the mountain's heart was the only reality that mattered. The air tasted of stone and secrets, heavy with the weight of knowledge that predated written history. She had not meant to come here. After leaving the king's chambers with her heart in pieces, she had intended to return to her small corner of existence and lose herself in the mindless comfort of familiar tasks. But her feet had carried her away from the compound, up the winding path that led to the sacred caves where the pack's oldest mystics communed with forces beyond mortal understanding. "I have been waiting for you, child of Silver Moon!" The voice emerged from the shadows at the cave's far end, dry as ancient parchment, but carrying an authority that made Kira's wolf immediately submit. The oracle stepped into the flickering light cast by oil lamps mounted in iron brackets, revealing a figure so old she seemed carved from the living rock itself. Morrigan. The name whispered through Kira's mind, though no one had spoken it aloud. This was the pack's eldest seer, a woman who claimed to remember the first wolves and the great binding that had created their laws. Most of the younger generation believed her to be mad, her prophecies dismissed as the ramblings of an addled mind, but the elders still sought her counsel when the moon was dark and difficult choices loomed. "I don't understand," Kira said, her voice seeming to echo strangely in the enclosed space. I'm nobody. I don't have silver anything." The oracle's laugh was like wind through dry leaves. "Oh, child, the lies they told you, the chains they wrapped around your true self to keep you small and hidden and safe." She moved closer, her steps silent on the stone floor, and Kira caught the scent of herbs and something else, something wild and dangerous that reminded her of midnight forests and hunting packs. What lies? The question escaped before Kira could stop it, though part of her feared the answer. Instead of responding with words, Morrigan gestured toward the cave's walls, and Kira saw for the first time that they were covered in carvings. Not the crude scratches of bored visitors, but intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the lamplight, telling stories in a language she did not recognize but somehow understood. "Behold the true history of your bloodline," the oracle intoned, her gnarled finger tracing patterns in the stone. "The Silver Moon Pack, rulers of the Northern Territories for 1,000 years. Masters of the ancient magics, keepers of the sacred bonds between wolf and spirit." The carvings showed wolves of impossible beauty and size, their forms surrounded by representations of light and power. At the centre of one particularly detailed panel, a female figure stood with arms raised toward a crescent moon, silver radiance flowing from her hands to bless the pack that knelt at her feet. "My parents were nobody," Kira whispered, but even as she spoke the words they felt hollow. She had never known her parents, had never been told more than the bare fact of their deaths when she was too young to remember. The pack had raised her out of charity, or so she had always believed. "Your parents were Lyrian and Elena of the Silver Moon bloodline," Morrigan said, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of ritual speech. "The last true alpha pair of the Northern Territories, murdered by traitors who feared their power and sought to claim their lands." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Kira reached out blindly for support, her hand finding the rough stone of the cave wall as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. "That's impossible. I would know. I would remember." "You were barely 2 years old when they died, child, and in their final moments, knowing that enemies surrounded them on all sides, they made a choice that saved your life and damned your childhood." The oracle's eyes, ancient and knowing, fixed on Kira's face with uncomfortable intensity. "They bound your wolf, sealed away your power, made you appear as weak and worthless as they could manage while still keeping you alive. The words hit like physical blows. Kira felt her carefully constructed understanding of herself crumbling, replaced by a truth so vast and terrible she could barely comprehend it. "Bound my wolf? How is that possible?" Morrigan moved to another section of the wall, where the carvings showed a ritual circle surrounded by robed figures. At the centre lay a child, silver light being drawn from her small form and locked away in crystalline containers. Ancient magic, older than the pack laws we follow today. They took your power and hid it so deep that even you believed yourself broken. It was the only way to keep you safe from those who would have finished what they started with your parents. "Who?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Who killed them?" But even as she asked, pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. The way certain pack members had always looked at her with something deeper than mere disdain. The careful distance the elders maintained, as if she carried some contagion they feared to catch. The complete absence of information about her origins, as if her parents had been erased from history itself. "The same families who now counsel your Alpha King toward a marriage that will place their puppet on the throne beside him," Morrigan said, confirming Kira's growing suspicions. They sought to eliminate the Silver Moon bloodline entirely to ensure that no rival power could challenge their political ambitions. Lady Seraphina. The name blazed through Kira's mind with sudden understanding. The perfect political bride, the alliance that would secure the Eastern Territories. But what if those territories had once belonged to different rulers? What if the families now offering alliance were the same ones who had murdered their way to power? "The binding is breaking," the oracle continued, her voice cutting through Kira's chaotic thoughts. "The mate bond with the Alpha King has triggered responses they could not have anticipated when they crafted the spell. Your true wolf is fighting to emerge, and soon the barriers will shatter entirely." As if summoned by her words, Kira felt something stir in the deepest part of herself, not the weak, cowering presence she had always known as her wolf, but something vast and silver and utterly fierce. Power flowed through her veins like liquid starlight, and for a moment she understood what she truly was beneath the layers of suppression and lies. "What happens when it breaks free?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "You become who you were always meant to be," Morrigan said simply. The Silver Moon Queen, heir to power that predates the current pack structures. Your wolf is not merely large or strong, it is ancient, connected to the old magics that shape this world. When she emerges, every wolf within 100 miles will feel her presence and know that the true bloodline has returned. The implications were staggering. No wonder the king's war beast had bowed to her. It had recognized something her own consciousness had been denied. No wonder the mate bond had formed with such intensity. He was not just any alpha, but the one wolf powerful enough to stand as equal partner to what she would become. "The sacred trials," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "That's why it's happening now, isn't it? The arena stones, the ancient rituals, they're weakening the binding." The oracle nodded approvingly. "Sacred ground calls to sacred blood. The trials were always meant to reveal truth, to separate the worthy from the pretenders. You cannot spend days walking on stones blessed by your ancestors without consequences." Kira closed her eyes, feeling the silver power pulse stronger with each heartbeat. The weak, worthless girl who had scrubbed blood from arena floors was a lie, a carefully constructed mask to hide something that threatened the established order. But masks could be discarded when they were no longer needed. "What do I do?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet the oracle's ancient gaze. "You prepare for war," Morrigan said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Because when your enemies realize what you truly are, they will not hesitate to finish what they began 20 years ago. The difference is that this time you will not be a helpless child." The silver power sang in her veins, promising strength and speed and abilities she had only dreamed of possessing. But with that promise came a terrible responsibility. the weight of a bloodline that had once ruled territories, the burden of justice for murders that had gone unpunished for too long. "The Alpha King," she said, thinking of the impossible choice that had torn them both apart. "He doesn't know, does he, about who I really am?" "Not yet," the oracle replied. "But he will. The mate bond will ensure that truth cannot remain hidden much longer, and when he learns what was taken from him, what was taken from both of you, his rage will shake the foundations of every territory that participated in the conspiracy." Kira nodded slowly, feeling pieces of herself clicking into place like armour being donned for battle. The girl who had accepted worthlessness was gone, replaced by someone who understood that power came with the obligation to use it. The Silver Moon Queen was awakening, and her enemies had reason to fear. The corridor was empty when Lady Seraphina stepped from the shadows. Kira had been making her way back from the oracle's cave, her mind still reeling from revelations that had shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. The silver power hummed beneath her skin like caged lightning, stronger now that she understood what it truly was, but still not fully awakened. She felt poised on the edge of transformation, balanced between the powerless girl she had been and the queen she was meant to become. She should have sensed the ambush, should have felt the predatory intent radiating from the alcove where Lady Seraphina waited with the patience of a spider in her web. But Kira's thoughts were turned inward, focused on the oracle's words and the terrible weight of her true heritage, and by the time she realized she was not alone, it was too late to retreat. "Well, well," Seraphina purred, her voice honey-sweet with venom beneath. "The little servant girl wandering the halls where she doesn't belong. How presumptuous." Even in the dim light of the corridor's oil lamps, Lady Seraphina was breathtaking. Her golden hair caught the flickering flames and threw them back in aureate waves, and her silk gown moved around her like liquid moonlight. She was everything Kira was not, polished, refined, born to power and privilege, the perfect queen for the perfect king. But there was something else in her beauty now, a cruel edge that had been hidden behind courtly manners during the public ceremonies. This was Lady Seraphina without her mask, and the sight sent ice through Kira's veins. "My lady," Kira said carefully, dropping into the submissive posture that had kept her safe for 20 years. But even as she lowered her eyes, the silver power pulsed in protest, demanding that she stand tall and meet this threat head-on. "Oh, don't bother with that," Seraphina said, with a dismissive wave of her jewelled hand. "We both know what happened in the arena today. The entire pack is buzzing with whispers about the impossible bond, the servant girl who somehow caught the attention of powers beyond her station." She began to circle Kira like a predator stalking wounded prey, her silk slippers making no sound on the stone floor. "Tell me, little mouse, what exactly did you do to enchant the Alpha King's war beast? What tricks did you use to make it bow to something as pathetic as you?" The insults should have hurt. They should have driven Kira back into the familiar shell of worthlessness where she had hidden for so long. But the oracle's words echoed in her mind. "You are the Silver Moon Queen, heir to power that predates the current pack structures." And for the first time in her life, the cruelty bounced off her like water off stone. "I didn't do anything," she said honestly, keeping her voice level despite the way Seraphina's presence made her skin crawl. "I don't understand what happened any more than you do." "Liar." The word cracked like a whip. "You think I don't know what you are, what your bloodline represents?" Seraphina's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "Did you think we wouldn't recognize the signs when they began to manifest?" The admission hung in the air between them like a poisoned blade. We, not I, but we. Confirmation that the oracle had spoken truth. Lady Seraphina was not just a rival for the king's affections, but part of the conspiracy that had murdered Kira's parents and stolen her birthright. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kira said, though her heart was racing now. The silver power responded to her fear and anger, coiling tighter in her chest like a spring under pressure. Of course you don't, Seraphina laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. Poor little orphan raised in ignorance of her true heritage, but ignorance won't protect you from the consequences of what you're becoming. She stopped circling and moved closer, close enough that Kira could smell her perfume, roses and ambition, and something that reminded her unpleasantly of decay. Let me educate you, since no one else has bothered. 20 years ago there was a problem, a bloodline that threatened the natural order, that stood in the way of progress and stability. That problem was resolved. The casual way she spoke of murder, as if Kira's parents had been nothing more than obstacles to be cleared from a path, sent rage blazing through the mate bond. Somewhere in the compound she felt the Alpha King's answering fury, his wolf responding to her emotional distress with protective instincts that transcended politics. And now, Seraphina continued, seemingly oblivious to the supernatural forces stirring in response to her threats, that same problem has resurfaced in the form of a grubby little servant who thinks she can steal what doesn't belong to her. I haven't stolen anything, Kira said, but her voice was stronger now, carrying undertones that made Seraphina's eyes narrow with suspicion. Haven't you? The Alpha King was meant to be mine, his alliance, his power, his throne, all of it secured through our marriage. But then you appeared with your pathetic sob story and your convenient timing, and suddenly everything we've worked toward for decades is in jeopardy. She reached into the folds of her gown and withdrew something that made Kira's blood freeze. A small crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even from a distance she could feel the malevolence radiating from it, could sense her wolf recoiling in instinctive terror. "This is Night's Bane," Seraphina said conversationally, holding the vial up to catch the lamplight. "Quite rare, quite expensive, and absolutely fatal to those with silver moon blood. A few drops in your evening meal, and you'll simply fade away, peacefully, quietly. No one will suspect murder, just the tragic death of a servant girl whose health was always fragile." The threat was delivered with such casual elegance that it took Kira a moment to process the full horror of what she was hearing. This woman, this perfect political bride, was calmly discussing assassination as if she were planning a dinner menu. "You killed them," Kira said, the words torn from her throat before she could stop them. "My parents, you and your family, you murdered them." Seraphina's smile was radiant with satisfaction. "Not personally, of course. I was only a child at the time. But yes, my father and his allies dealt with the Silver Moon problem quite thoroughly, or so we thought." She stepped closer still, close enough that Kira could see the madness lurking behind her beautiful blue eyes. "You should have stayed hidden, little mouse, should have accepted your place as a powerless nobody and lived out your days in comfortable obscurity. But you just had to reach for things beyond your station, didn't you?" The silver power was building now, responding to mortal danger with an intensity that made Kira's vision blur at the edges. She could feel barriers cracking, ancient bindings straining against forces they were never meant to contain indefinitely. The Oracle had warned her this would happen, but she had not expected it to be so violent, so overwhelming. "The Alpha King will never choose you," Seraphina continued, oblivious to the supernatural storm building in the girl before her. "Even if he feels some misguided attraction, duty will triumph in the end. It always does with men like him. And once our marriage is complete, once my position is secure, your little problem will be permanently resolved." She held up the vial again, letting the light catch its malevolent contents. "This could happen tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. Entirely up to you, really. Disappear quietly, and I might be merciful enough to make it quick. Continue to pursue what doesn't belong to you, and I promise your death will be as slow and painful as I can arrange." Something snapped inside Kira's chest. Not the mate bond, but something older and more fundamental. The last of the binding chains that had held her true self prisoner for 20 years shattered like glass, and power flooded through her system like molten silver. For the first time in her life, she stood to her full height and met an enemy's gaze without flinching. No, she said simply. The word carried weight that made the corridor's stone walls tremble. Seraphina stumbled backward, her perfect composure cracking as she finally sensed the magnitude of what she was facing. The vial slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor and sending its poisonous contents spreading across the stones. "You want to know what I am?" Kira continued, silver light beginning to emanate from her skin like captured starlight. "I am the daughter of Lyrian and Elena, last queen of the Silver Moon bloodline. I am the mate chosen by the Alpha King's own wolf, and I am done being afraid of you." The transformation was beginning whether she was ready or not, power breaking free after decades of suppression. She could feel her bones lengthening, her muscles restructuring themselves, her consciousness expanding to encompass abilities she had never dreamed of possessing. Lady Seraphina's scream echoed down the corridor as she fled from the silver light that turned night into day, from the girl who had finally remembered she was meant to be a queen. Behind her, Kira stood in the ruins of her old identity and smiled with teeth that were already beginning to sharpen into something far more dangerous than any political rival had prepared to face. The poison burned like liquid fire in her veins. Kira collapsed to her knees in the great hall, her evening meal scattered across the floor as convulsions racked her body. Around her, the sounds of the feast dissolved into chaos, chairs scraping against stone, voices raised in alarm, the clatter of dishes as pack members scrambled away from what they assumed was some contagious affliction. But this was no natural illness. Even through the agony that felt like her blood had been replaced with molten metal, she could sense the supernatural malevolence of the substance coursing through her system. Nightsbane, just as Lady Seraphina had promised, though delivered sooner than expected and in a dose meant to kill rather than merely threaten. "Get the healer!" someone shouted, though the voice seemed to come from very far away. "Quickly, before—" The words cut off in a strangled gasp, and through her blurred vision, Kira saw why. The Alpha King was moving through the crowd like an avenging storm, his presence so overwhelming that lesser wolves pressed themselves against the walls rather than risk blocking his path. His eyes blazed with fury that transcended mere anger, becoming something primal and terrifying that spoke to the deepest instincts of every creature in the hall. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her convulsing form as if he wanted to touch her but feared making the pain worse. Through the mate bond, she could feel his rage burning like a sun, could sense his wolf howling for blood and vengeance against whoever had dared harm what belonged to him. Who? The single word carried enough menace to make the great hall fall silent. Who did this? But Kira could not answer. The poison was doing more than attacking her body. It was targeting something deeper, something that recognized her as Silver Moon bloodline and sought to destroy the very essence of what she was. She could feel ancient barriers cracking under the assault, power that had been bound for 20 years beginning to bleed through the cracks like silver light escaping from a shattered prism. The healer arrived in a rush of herb-scented robes and clinical efficiency, her weathered hands already reaching for Kira's throat to check her pulse. But the moment her fingers made contact with skin that was beginning to glow with supernatural radiance, she jerked back as if burned. "This is not natural poison," she whispered, her voice heavy with a fear that made the watching pack members murmur uneasily. "This is Nightsbane, crafted specifically to target bloodlines that carry the old magics. But the dose—" She looked up at the Alpha King with eyes wide with horror. "Your Majesty, this dose should have killed her instantly. The fact that she's still breathing means—" "Means what?" His voice cut like a blade through her stammering explanation. "Means her bloodline is far more powerful than whoever administered this expected. The poison is fighting something that refuses to die, and the conflict is tearing her apart from the inside." As if summoned by the healer's words, another wave of agony crashed through Kira's body, but this time it brought something else with it. A surge of silver power so intense it lit up the great hall like captured starlight. Ancient magic, suppressed for decades, was fighting the poison with everything it possessed, and the battle was visible to every wolf present. She heard gasps, saw pack members stumbling backward as they recognized power that belonged in legends rather than their mundane reality. Silver light poured from her skin in waves, washing over stone walls carved with symbols that began to glow in response to the presence of blood they had been created to serve. "Impossible," Elder Thorn breathed, but his voice carried awe rather than disbelief. "The Silver Moon bloodline, but they were all—" "Murdered," the Alpha King finished, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. 20 years ago, they were all supposed to have been murdered. The admission hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Through her pain-hazed vision, Kira saw understanding dawn on the faces around her. Not just that she carried royal blood, but that her parents' deaths had been deliberate, politically motivated assassinations, rather than the accidents they had been portrayed as. "The binding is breaking," the healer whispered, her hands moving in protective gestures as silver light continued to pour from Kira's convulsing form. "Whatever spell was used to suppress her power, the Nightsbane is destroying it, but the release, it's too much, too fast. Her body can't contain this much magic without proper preparation." Pain lanced through every bone as they began to crack and reform, as her spine elongated and her face pushed forward into something that was no longer entirely human. She heard herself scream, but the sound came out as a howl, long and mournful, and filled with 20 years of suppressed rage finally finding its voice. The transformation was violent, uncontrolled, nothing like the smooth shifts she had witnessed from other pack members. This was raw power breaking free of chains that had held it prisoner for decades, and the process felt like being reborn through fire and silver light. Through the mate bond, she felt the Alpha King's amazement and terror in equal measure. He was witnessing something that should not have been possible, the emergence of a bloodline that was supposed to have been extinct, power that dwarfed anything their current pack structures were designed to contain. Her wolf was emerging at last, but it was not the weak, cowering creature she had always sensed in the depths of her consciousness. This was something magnificent and terrible, ancient beyond measure, with fur that gleamed like polished silver and eyes that held depths like starlight on water. This was a war beast in her own right, bred for battle and born to rule, and her very presence made the lesser wolves in the hall whimper with instinctive submission. But the poison was still burning through her system, still fighting the power that refused to be destroyed. The conflict was tearing her apart, and she could feel her consciousness fragmenting under the strain of containing forces that were never meant to be unleashed so violently. "She's dying," the healer said, her voice cutting through the supernatural chaos. "The magic is too strong, but the Nightsbane won't let it stabilize. She needs her mate," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Before anyone could protest or question the political implications, he was moving, his hands finding her silver-furred form and pulling her against his chest. The moment they touched, the mate bond blazed to life with intensity that made the air crackle with electricity. Golden light met silver in a fusion that sent shockwaves through the great hall, and suddenly Kira could breathe again. The king's strength flowed through their connection, stabilizing the chaotic magic that had threatened to tear her apart, giving her power a foundation strong enough to support its full emergence. The transformation completed itself with a grace that had been impossible moments before. Her wolf settled into its new form with satisfaction that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile, and when she looked up at the Alpha King through eyes that now burned with silver fire, she saw her own recognition reflected back at her. This was who she was meant to be. This was what had been stolen from her, and hidden away by enemies who feared what the Silver Moon bloodline represented. Around them, the great hall had gone silent except for the sound of awed breathing. Pack members stared at the impossible tableau, their Alpha King holding a silver war beast that blazed with power older than their bloodlines, his own wolf responding to her presence with the reverence due to an equal rather than a subject. "The Silver Moon Queen has returned," Elder Thorn whispered, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "The old bloodlines are awakening." But even as Kira revelled in the strength that now flowed through her transformed body, she was acutely aware that this public display had changed everything. There could be no more hiding, no more pretending to be a powerless servant. Every wolf in the territory now knew what she truly was, and that knowledge would reach her enemies within hours. The war that had claimed her parents 20 years ago was about to begin again, and this time she would not be a helpless child caught in the crossfire. This time she would fight back. The confrontation came at dawn, when the great hall still echoed with whispers of what everyone had witnessed. Kira stood beside the Alpha King as he faced the assembled Pack Council, her silver wolf form radiating power that made the ancient stones themselves seem to hum with recognition. She had not shifted back to human form since the transformation, partly because the sensation of finally being herself was too intoxicating to relinquish, but mostly because she understood the statement her presence made. The Silver Moon Queen had returned, and there could be no doubt about what that meant for the established order. Lady Seraphina sat among the visiting dignitaries, her perfect composure intact despite the chaos her assassination attempt had unleashed. She met Kira's silver gaze without flinching, her blue eyes cold with calculation, rather than the fear any rational person should feel when facing a creature that could tear her apart without breaking stride. "The evidence is clear," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute rule. "Someone attempted to murder my mate with nightsbane poison, a substance that can only be obtained through channels connected to the old bloodline wars. I want answers, and I want them now." His war beast lounged beside Kyra's silver form, the two ancient creatures presenting a united front that spoke of power beyond anything the current generation had seen. The pack members pressed themselves deeper into their seats, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing forces that could reshape their world with a thought. Elder Thorn cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, with respect, perhaps this matter would be better handled through quieter channels. The political implications of these accusations—" "The political implications?" The king's voice dropped to a growl that made every wolf in the hall freeze. "Someone tried to kill the heir to the Silver Moon bloodline, and you're concerned about politics?" "The Silver Moon bloodline was declared extinct 20 years ago," Lord Matthias interjected, his tone carefully neutral despite the way his eyes kept darting nervously toward Kira's imposing form. If these claims are true, it raises uncomfortable questions about past events. Kira felt the mate bond pulse with her king's rage. He knew, she realized, perhaps not all the details, but enough to understand that her parents' deaths had not been the random tragedies they were portrayed as. The revelation was burning through him like acid, fury at the deception combined with grief for injustices he had been too young to prevent. "Uncomfortable questions," he repeated softly, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. "Is that what we're calling the systematic murder of an entire royal bloodline?" Lady Seraphina rose gracefully from her seat, her silk gown catching the morning light as she glided forward with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. These wild accusations based on nothing more than a servant girl's delusions of grandeur." The king's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, and the gesture was enough to make the royal guard tense with readiness. "Careful, Lady Seraphina, very careful. That servant girl is my acknowledged mate, and any insult to her is an insult to me." But Seraphina's smile never wavered. "Of course, Your Majesty. I would never dream of insulting your choices. But surely even you must see the impossibility of what is being suggested. A secret bloodline, hidden for decades, conveniently revealed just as political alliances are being finalised. She spread her hands in a gesture of reasonable incredulity. It's almost as if someone with an interest in disrupting the Eastern Alliance has crafted an elaborate deception designed to— Enough! The word came from Kira, spoken in a voice that carried undertones of silver bells and winter wind. She rose from her position beside the king's throne, her massive silver form moving with liquid grace as she padded into the centre of the hall. Power radiated from her like heat from a forge, and when she spoke again, it was with authority that bypassed political manoeuvring entirely. "You want proof of what I am?" she asked, her silver eyes fixed on Lady Seraphina's perfect face. "You want evidence of bloodline and birthright?" She began to shift, the transformation smooth and controlled this time, silver light flowing around her like liquid starlight as she took human form. But she was not the same girl who had scrubbed blood from arena stones just days before. This was the Silver Moon Queen in her full glory, power evident in every line of her body, ancient authority blazing in eyes that held depths like captured starlight. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the very stones of the hall resonate in response. "I am Kira, daughter of Lyrian and Elena, last queen of the Silver Moon territories. I am the bloodline you thought you had destroyed, the power you believed you had contained." She turned to address the assembled council, her presence demanding attention from every wolf present. 20 years ago, my parents were murdered by a conspiracy of Eastern families who coveted their lands and feared their power. I was hidden, my abilities bound, my true nature suppressed to keep me safe from those who would finish what they started. Murmurs rippled through the hall, but she continued before anyone could interrupt. But bindings break, and power will not be denied forever. The mate bond with your Alpha King has awakened what was always meant to be, and now you must choose. She gestured toward Lady Seraphina, who had gone very still despite her maintained composure. You can continue to support the families who built their wealth on murder and deception, who offer alliances paid for with the blood of innocents, or you can stand with the true bloodline, with justice for crimes that have gone unpunished for far too long. "Prove it," Lady Seraphina said, her voice sharp with challenge. "If you truly are what you claim, prove your bloodline before witnesses who cannot be deceived." It was exactly the opening Kira had been waiting for. She moved to the centre of the hall where ancient symbols were carved into the stone floor, marks that most pack members assumed were merely decorative, but which she now understood were something far more significant. "The bloodline stones," Elder Thorn whispered, recognition dawning in his aged eyes. "They haven't responded to anyone in living memory." Kira placed her bare feet on the carved symbols, and the effect was immediate and undeniable. Silver light blazed up from the stones, racing along carved channels that formed intricate patterns across the entire hall. Ancient magic, dormant for decades, roared to life in response to the presence of blood it was designed to recognize. The light reached the walls and ignited symbols that had been dark for so long most pack members had forgotten they existed. Names blazed forth in silver fire: Lyrian, Elena, and dozens of other Silver Moon rulers stretching back through centuries of history. And at the end of the luminous genealogy, new letters formed themselves in flowing script. Kira, rightful queen, returned to claim what was stolen. The hall erupted in chaos as the political implications crashed down on everyone present. This was not deception or clever manoeuvring. This was proof that could not be argued with or explained away. The Silver Moon bloodline lived, and with it legitimate claims to territories that certain families had considered their own for 2 decades. But Lady Seraphina was no longer smiling. The mask of perfect composure had finally cracked, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "You think this changes anything?" she snarled, her beautiful face twisted with rage. You think bloodline alone is enough to undo 20 years of careful work? She raised her hand, and Kira saw the glint of steel hidden in her palm. Not a blade, but something worse. Another vial, larger than the first, filled with liquid that made the air itself recoil in horror. "If I cannot have him," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the madness of someone who had staked everything on a single gamble, "then no one will." She hurled the vial toward the Alpha King with deadly accuracy, but she had not accounted for the reflexes of a fully awakened Silver Moon Queen. Kira moved faster than thought, intercepting the projectile with her bare hand and crushing it before the poisoned contents could reach their target. Nightsbane splashed across her palm, but this time her power was ready for it. Silver light blazed around the poison, neutralizing its malevolence before it could penetrate her skin. She stood in the center of the great hall, with her hands still glowing, proof of power that could not be threatened by the weapons that had once seemed so deadly. The silence that followed was absolute. "Seize her!" the Alpha King commanded, his voice cutting through the shocked stillness like a blade. The royal guard moved immediately, surrounding Lady Seraphina before she could attempt another desperate gambit. But the damage to the political alliance was already done. The Eastern Territories' representatives were backing away from their former ally, recognizing that association with an attempted regicide would destroy them. The careful web of agreements and treaties that had taken years to negotiate was unravelling in real time. "The Eastern Alliance is hereby dissolved," the king announced, his gaze fixed on the woman who had tried to murder his mate twice in as many days. "Any territory that wishes to maintain relations with this crown will need to renegotiate from a position of honesty rather than deception." He moved to stand beside Kira, his presence reinforcing her authority before the assembled witnesses. "Lady Seraphina will be held for trial on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy in the deaths of King Lyrian and Queen Eleanor. Any who aided in these crimes will face justice." The transformation was complete, not just of Kira's power, but of the entire political landscape that had defined the territories for 2 decades. The Alpha King had chosen his mate over political convenience, chosen justice over stability, and in doing so had declared that some things mattered more than maintaining the status quo. As the guards led Lady Seraphina away, her composure finally shattered completely. "You think this ends it?" she screamed over her shoulder. "You think revealing the truth will keep you safe? There are others who will never let the Silver Moon bloodline threaten their power again." The threats echoed in the great hall long after she was gone, but Kira felt no fear. The girl who had cowered in shadows was gone forever, replaced by a queen who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The Alpha King took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining as the mate bond settled into something deeper than mere recognition. This was partnership, equality, a joining of powers that could reshape the world if they chose to use it. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, his voice meant for her alone, despite the crowd that surrounded them. She looked out over the assembled pack members, saw the awe and uncertainty in their faces as they grappled with the reality of what she represented. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be other conspirators to root out, other challenges to face, other attempts to destroy what they had built together. But she was no longer afraid. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. The arena had never seen anything like this. Kira stepped across the threshold of the sacred circle as the first rays of dawn painted the ancient stones gold and crimson, and every wolf present felt the shift in the very air itself. This was not just another trial. This was the awakening of power that predated their laws and challenged every assumption about what was possible within these hallowed walls. The Alpha King stood at the ceremonial dais, but his attention was not on the crowd of witnesses who had gathered to see the impossible. His gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made the mate bond sing between them, golden threads of connection that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. He had given her this chance, not just to prove herself, but to claim her birthright before every wolf in the territory. Around the arena's perimeter, pack members pressed against the viewing walls with expressions that range from awe to terror to desperate curiosity. Word had spread throughout the compound about what had transpired in the Great Hall, about bloodline stones that blazed with recognition and assassination attempts that had failed against awakened power. But seeing those stories and witnessing the reality were entirely different things. Elder Thorn raised the ceremonial horn to his lips, its deep note echoing off stone walls that had heard the same sound for 1,000 years. "Let the sacred trials begin," he intoned, his aged voice carrying clearly across the circle. "Let truth be revealed and worth be proven before the eyes of the moon goddess herself." But as the ritual words faded into silence, Kira felt something far more significant than traditional ceremony taking hold. The arena stones beneath her feet were responding to her presence, ancient magic stirring in recognition of blood they had been carved to serve. Silver light began to seep from the symbols etched into the floor, faint at first, but growing stronger with each heartbeat. She had entered the circle in human form, but she could feel her wolf pacing restlessly just beneath her skin, eager to finally claim the space that had always belonged to their bloodline. The suppression that had defined her entire life was completely gone now, replaced by power that flowed through her like liquid starlight. The transformation began without conscious direction, her body responding to the sacred ground's call with an inevitability that felt like coming home. But this was not the violent, chaotic awakening that had nearly torn her apart in the Great Hall. This was controlled, purposeful, a display of mastery that spoke to 20 years of denied potential finally finding its expression. Silver light poured from her skin as bones shifted and muscles reformed, as her consciousness expanded to encompass abilities that had been locked away since childhood. The pain was there, but it was overwhelmed by a sense of rightness so profound it made her previous existence feel like a shadow cast by someone else's life. Her wolf emerged in all its ancient glory, massive beyond anything the current generation had seen, with fur that gleamed like polished silver and eyes that held depths like captured starlight. This was not just a shifted form, but a war beast in the truest sense, bred for battle and born to rule, carrying genetic memory that stretched back to the first wolves who had walked these lands. The effect on the assembled witnesses was immediate and devastating. Lesser wolves whimpered and pressed themselves against the walls, their instincts recognizing something that transcended the usual pack hierarchies. Even the elders accustomed to displays of supernatural power stared in stunned silence at what stood before them. But the arena stones were not finished. As Kira's transformation completed itself, the ancient symbols carved into the floor blazed to life with silver fire, racing along channels that formed intricate patterns across the entire sacred space. Power that had lain dormant for decades roared to life in response to the presence of blood it was designed to recognize and serve. The very walls began to glow, revealing carvings that had been invisible for so long that most pack members had forgotten they existed. Scenes of silver moon rulers stretching back through centuries of history, their forms surrounded by the same silver radiance that now emanated from Kira's transformed shape. This was genealogy written in stone and starlight, proof of lineage that could not be denied or disputed. At the arena's centre, where the most sacred of the symbols converged, a pillar of silver light erupted skyward with such intensity that it could be seen for miles. The very air crackled with energy that made the hair on every wolf's neck stand on end, and several of the younger pack members fell to their knees in instinctive submission to power that dwarfed anything they had ever experienced. Through it all, Kira stood at the heart of the supernatural storm, her silver wolf form radiating authority that spoke to the deepest genetic memories of every creature present. This was what the Silver Moon bloodline had always been, not merely powerful, but connected to forces that shaped the very foundations of their world. The Alpha King's war beast, that legendary creature which bowed to no one save its master, padded into the arena circle with movements that spoke of reverence rather than challenge. It approached Kira's transformed form with the careful grace of one ancient power acknowledging another, and when it lowered its massive head in a gesture of perfect respect, the political implications crashed through the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Even the Alpha King's own war beast recognized her supremacy. Even the creature that had stood beside him as he conquered territories and united warring packs acknowledged that she was something beyond the usual hierarchies that governed their world. But Kira was not finished. The power flowing through the arena stones had awakened something else. Memories that belonged not to her conscious mind, but to the bloodline itself, genetic knowledge passed down through generations of Silver Moon queens. She understood now why the arena had been built in this specific location, why the stones had been carved with these particular symbols. This was not just a place of trials. This was a throne room designed by her ancestors to respond to royal blood and display the true extent of Silver Moon power. The ceremonies held here for the past 20 years had been pale shadows of what the arena was truly capable of when activated by the bloodline it was created to serve. She lifted her great silver head and howled, the sound carrying harmonics that resonated through bone and stone alike. It was not the call of an ordinary wolf, but something far more profound. A song of awakening that announced to every supernatural creature within 100 miles that the Silver Moon bloodline had returned to claim what was rightfully theirs. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the forest surrounding the compound came answering calls, wild wolves and other creatures of the old bloodlines responding to a summons they had been waiting decades to hear. The very foundations of the established order were shifting, ancient alliances reforming in response to power that had been absent for far too long. Pack members stared in terrified fascination as the implications became clear. This was not just the awakening of an individual, this was the return of an entire bloodline, complete with all the political and supernatural upheaval that implied. Territories that had been considered settled for 20 years were suddenly open to question. Alliances built on the assumption that certain bloodlines were extinct would need to be completely renegotiated. At the ceremonial dais, the Alpha King stood with an expression that mixed pride, awe, and something that might have been relief. Through the mate bond, Kira could feel his emotions, wonder at what she truly was, satisfaction that his instincts had recognized her worth before his conscious mind understood it, and a fierce possessive pride that spoke to the deepest levels of their connection. This was his mate, his equal, the queen who would stand beside his throne and help reshape the world according to their combined vision. The political marriage to Lady Seraphina had never been more than a convenient alliance, but this was something that transcended politics entirely. As the silver light began to stabilize around her transformed form, Kira felt the ancient magic of the arena settling into new patterns, recognizing her as its rightful mistress after decades of serving lesser powers. The stones would remember this day, would respond to her presence for as long as she walked among the living. She had entered the sacred circle as a servant girl with hidden potential. She would leave it as the acknowledged Silver Moon Queen, with power that could not be questioned or denied. The trials were far from over, but the most important test had already been passed. She had claimed her birthright before witnesses who could never again pretend she was anything less than what she truly was. Around the arena's perimeter, pack members began to murmur among themselves, the sound building like approaching thunder as they grappled with the reality of what they had witnessed. Some faces showed fear at the upheaval this would bring to their comfortable certainties. Others reflected excitement at the prospect of serving true power rather than mere political convenience. But all of them, without exception, recognized that everything had changed. The Silver Moon Queen had awakened, and the world would never be the same.